Hi everyone, and welcome back to my Photography Basics series. Today we're going to be talking about camera settings. The fancy little button up here. Depending on your camera, DSLR like this, you're going to have a little setting button at the top. Sometimes it will be located on the back as well. Otherwise, if you're going to have a compact camera, quite often it's in a little touch screen on the back of the camera. Or some of them will have a little dial as well, a little bit simplified. I'm going to be basing this on the settings in a DSLR because there are generally more settings in here. But a lot of this will relate to pretty much every camera you've got. Even on your smartphone, you will find a lot of these settings if you dial down into the more advanced settings and menus of your camera app. You can also get advanced camera apps for your smartphones as well that will have a lot of these settings in it. A lot of them are digitally done as opposed to a DSLR where there are a lot of mechanically done settings in here. Yeah, we're going to touch on that, so let's get stuck into it. Alrighty, so as I said, we are going to be talking about the DSLR mostly today. The main advantage to a DSLR and why I'm going to be talking about this mostly, it's what I shoot with majority of the time. Even my old film cameras are considered an SLR camera, or majority of my film cameras are. The beauty of this, DSLRs will give you a lot more functionality and a lot more settings and advanced features that you can work into and grow into as you get used to your photography. So the first one we're going to talk about is auto mode. Okay, so auto mode is the default setting on most DSLRs. It'll be represented by either a little A or a green square like this on a lot of cameras. A little square with an A in it. There's all sorts of different ways that it'll be represented. But if you look at your camera manual, it will tell you which one it is. Beauty with auto mode, it's perfect for beginners. It will literally set everything for you in the camera. There's nothing you have to think about. It just effectively turns into a big advanced point and shoot camera that I've talked about in previous videos. Set your focus if you've got a choice between an autofocus and manual focus. Switch like this one does, set it to autofocus, set your camera to auto at the top, and literally just point, look through your viewfinder, look on your screen, however your camera's set up, point and shoot, take your photos. That's all there is to it. Nice and simple, easy way to start off, and you're going to get some really nice images out of that. Okay, so next up is AV. See there? Get in focus for me. AV or aperture priority. Aperture priority, this allows you to control the aperture value or the depth of field of your image. Basically, you pick the aperture value you want based on an f-stop. So aperture is spoken about in f-stop, so f1.8, f5.6, f8, f16, depending on what you want. And the camera will adjust the rest of the settings to fit, or will adjust your shutter speed to suit the aperture. Basically, your aperture value is going to control the depth of field of the image. So it's going to effectively how much away from the camera is going to be in focus, depending on your aperture value. So a small aperture value, like 1.8 for instance, you're going to have a very short depth of field. So there's going to be a very small plane of focus in that image. Going to be things like portraits and stuff. You see a lot of detailed photos, so cars, if you're doing photography of cars, like we're sort of talking about mostly here, you'll find if you're doing a detail photo, for instance, you're going to want a smaller aperture value. So if you're doing details of the engine, you can focus on one thing. A lot of the stuff around it's going to be blurred. If you're doing sort of detail shots around the outside, like the grille, for instance, and you want the grille to be in focus, but you want the back end of the photo, or the back of the photo to be out of focus, you need a smaller depth of field. If you're doing a whole photo of a car, you want the whole thing nice and sharp and crisp, you're going to want a higher aperture value, so like an f16 or something is going to get the whole car in focus. The beauty with this is if you're shooting, it's more for still type photography, so like static shots of like cars in the pits, things like that. It lets you control and lets you set your subject out. So if you've got a blurry background, quite often you see it, the subject's nice and crystal clear and crisp, but then away from that, you're going to have the background is blurred. It kind of makes the subject stand out a little bit more. If you want more of a crowd type shot or more of a environment atmospheric type shot, to kind of get the whole crowd and the whole scene in the photo, you can use a bigger aperture just to get more of that area in focus, so you can see more of the image. It sort of gives that whole feel of what's going on around the image and around the subject. So we will go into a lot more detail in this because there is a lot to do with aperture, and explaining it and actually understanding it and getting a really good understanding of it is going to let you really develop your photos later on. I generally will use aperture priority more for static shots, as I said. The next one we're going to talk about is TV, or TV's your shutter priority, time value priority. That I use a lot more for fast moving, so sports, actual racing photos and stuff, just because it's going to let me get a little bit more of a crystal clear shot. Alrighty, so the next one we're talking about, as I said, is TV mode. I'm holding this upside down, aren't I? The TV mode, TV, or shutter priority mode. So shutter priority mode, as opposed to AV mode, that is set to, aperture dictates how much light is let in one go. Time is how long that light's allowed into the lens or into the sensor or film, or depending on what you're shooting. So similar to AV mode or aperture priority, your shutter priority mode or TV mode will set a fixed value on your shutter speed, and the camera will then adjust the aperture depending on what's happening, depending on the brightness and whatever else is going on around the photo. As I said, this one is much, I use this more for fast moving stuff. So a smaller shutter speed is going to give you a lot more motion blur. So if you ever see the photos of cars, they've tracked the car's nice and sharp, and then the background's all blurry. It gives that image of movement in the background. It looks like you can see the car almost moving in the still photo, as opposed to you get the action shots of their. I'm trying to think of a good example. You quite often see it in like the Isle of Man TT, the bike race, jumping over. A rally is a really good one. See them jumping over in the foreground, the car, the background, everything's nice and crystal clear. They're going to be using a higher shutter speed to capture that image really, really quickly. The beauty with that is you can kind of mess around with it and give that real sense of movement in a photo. Obviously, the slower the shutter speed, the better you've got to be at tracking the subject, tracking the car or whatever you're taking a photo of. Otherwise, you're going to get a lot of blur in the actual subject as well. There's kind of this happy balance, happy medium that you've got to find between the two. I tend to use this if I need to use something, if I find the light's changing a lot, or especially if you're shooting at night, on a track at night, and they've got the bright lights, you need a lot of different highlights and shadows as the car's moving around the track. So rather than in manual mode and adjusting everything constantly, I tend to find I put it on shutter priority or TV mode, and then the camera will adjust my aperture mode for me. It does lose a little bit of control, and it does kind of change up the look of the images a little bit, which takes a little bit more work in post. But I find I get a lot better, a lot more control just adjusting it, keeping it to one sort of shutter priority, and then I can kind of adjust everything else after that. So a fast shutter speed, something like a 1/1000th of a second, will freeze the action. So your shutter speed is dictated in seconds, usually fractions of a second. Fast shutter speed, so like a 1/1000th of a second, it's going to really freeze the action. So it's going to freeze the motion, prevent motion blur, and it's going to give you a nice crystal sharp, clear image. While something like a 1/4 of a second is going to create a lot of motion blur, so it's going to give you that blurred background in the back of the photo. If you're tracking a subject properly, it's going to give you that feel of motion. It's actually going to let you feel the sense of the car or the subject moving through the photo. You can also see this if you look at, probably all seen, photos of the beach or photos of water, and it has that kind of almost like a misty haze across the water. That's going to be a really long aperture, so it's going to be, rather than a fraction of a second, it might be a 2 second or a 3 second, or you see the star trail shots, they can be 30 seconds up to a couple of minutes worth of photos where they capture that image of the stars moving across the sky. It's going to let a lot more light in, or it's going to let light in for a longer time into your camera. Go into this a little bit deeper, because talking about light and controlling light is the essence of photography, but it is a very big subject that I'm going to have to break down into a lot more. So this is just the basics of photography, so don't need to get into that. You just need to know the basics here. 1/1000 is going to be a nice sharp image. 1/4 of a second is obviously going to give you a lot more motion blur, but then you've also got to track your subject a little bit more confident in your stability of your camera. This is where a tripod or a monopod or something comes in to help you out with that. All right, and finally, there is manual mode, my absolute favorite. And as you get more advanced, you'll see why. So manual mode, big old M on your camera, right there. So manual mode is going to give you complete control of everything. For obvious reasons, it's the most advanced setting on a camera. It's going to give you a lot more control. It's going to give you complete control. Not a lot more control, it's going to give you complete control over everything. Your ISO, your aperture, your shutter speed, your white balance, everything in the camera, you're going to have control over. What this does is it lets you get your style and your essence of the photos in camera. You find you're going to get a lot less if you know what you're doing, you need a lot less post-processing needed to be done on the images because you're going to get them right out of camera. I use manual mode 99.9% of the time. As I said, I will occasionally use time value if it's really weird lighting that's kind of chopping and changing just to make sure I'm getting the right exposures. But even then, the camera can get tricked. It is just a computer. It can't see what is coming through the lens. It kind of takes an average of the image that's being displayed on its sensor and uses its electronics to kind of process and take an educated guess as to what you're trying to do or get a balanced image. Sometimes we don't want a balanced image. Sometimes we want something that's got a lot of contrast. Sometimes we want something that's really bright. If you're shooting something that's white, for instance, in bright light, even if it's on a black background, the camera is going to think that the image is overexposed because that white's showing up really, really bright on the sensor. It's going to think the image is overexposed and it's going to crank everything down. You're going to end up with a very underexposed image. Manual settings, I can adjust that and I know what I'm looking at. Even if the settings and the little graphs and stuff are showing that it's going to be overexposed and the camera's trying to tell me it's overexposed, I know what I'm going to get because I know what I'm looking at, so I can make that judgment call. So it's going to give you complete image control, complete control over everything in your camera. Obviously, this is a more advanced setting, something that you, by all means, muck around with. It's a good way of experimenting and finding out what those different settings do as well. Whacking onto manual mode, adjust a couple of things, take a few photos, adjust it again, take a few photos. The only thing I would suggest is adjust one setting at a time. So set it to manual mode, play around with the, set it to one fixed shutter speed, for instance. Muck around with the aperture and see what the image does, see the differences it makes. And then again, set it to one aperture mode and adjust your shutter speed. See the difference it makes to different subjects, see what it makes to the background, the foreground, light, the blur. Adjust your white balance, adjust your ISO, adjust one thing at a time and just see what it does to the image. And it's going to give you a good idea and an easy way of experimenting and seeing what the differences makes to the image and finding your own style of image. It's a really, really good way of kind of mucking around, but eventually you do want to build up to that and use that as your main setting because it's going to give you so much more control over your camera. Even your basic point and shoots and stuff generally will have some form of manual mode. It may not have as in-depth control. It might just give you your aperture, your shutter speed, your aperture as well. Aperture is quite often a mechanical thing. So the digital, again, the little basic ones are just going to be a digital kind of adjustment in the camera itself, but it's still going to give you a bit more control over your photos. Even your smartphones don't have a mechanical aperture. It is purely digital, but if you go into your smartphones, they're all going to have a pro settings mode these days. Pretty much any of your modern camera or modern smartphones will have a pro mode in their video and their photo settings. And you can adjust your aperture, your white balance, your ISO. You can adjust everything in there to actually get a much better image out of the camera. Again, digital, but you can have a lot more control and you can play around with it. It's still going to give you the same sort of effect. The final image isn't going to be as crystal clear and high res as what you'd expect out of one where it's mechanically done. But in saying that, it's going to let you muck around, it's going to let you experiment and find out what those different settings actually do to your photo and the final product. It's going to let you see how much more processing you need to do post if you screw up an image, or what you can get away with and what you can't get away with in post processing, as opposed to bring an exposed and a well underexposed image up, as opposed to trying to bring an overexposed image down to bring it back into balance into what you want. That's your manual mode. Alrighty guys, so there you have it. That is the 4 main modes on a SLR or a DSLR camera. I said auto mode, perfect for beginners, perfect starting out. Grab it, set it to auto, point, shoot, have some fun. Your AV and your TV modes are going to give you a little bit more control of the image over different aspects of the image. Good little step up and to kind of muck around with the different images, different outlooks and image outcomes you can get. And then manual mode, as I said, gives you complete control of your image over all the settings in the camera, lets you experiment and kind of come up with all sorts of different things. So best thing I can suggest, grab your camera, stick a fresh memory card in it, get it there and experiment. See which mode fits you best, see which mode works best for you, see which settings work best for you, and start coming up with your own style. So I hope this has been hope this has been help to you. Again, as always, like and subscribe down below. Don't forget to turn your notifications on so you don't miss any of these videos. I will see you in the next one, guys. Thanks for watching.